Good afternoon, everyone. The International Parking and Mobility Institute presents today's Learning Lab, Getting What You Want from Your Parking RFP, Smart Parking, presented by ABM Aviation. My name is Kenny, and I'll be moderating for ABM today. As a reminder, today's presentation is being recorded. We will make the recording available online and we'll post it to IPMI's YouTube channel within a few days. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping rules for today. This Learning Lab will last 60 minutes with a Q&A session at the end. Please keep your mics muted unless called upon. If you wish to speak on camera, please use the Zoom raise hand function and we will get to you. If you have any questions for today's speakers, please feel free to queue up a question at any time by typing in the chat. We will get to them as time allows. To ask a question, click on the chat icon in the Zoom menu and a window will appear. Please type your question and hit enter. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Jeff Cushman, Director, National Programs, ABM Aviation, and John Payne, CEO and Principal Analyst, Pueblo Technology Group, Inc. Jeff Cushman has worked airport landside operations both as a contractor and as employee of an airport authority since 1994. He currently serves as the Director, National Programs for ABM Aviation, where he acts as the gatekeeper for new technology and provides operational consistency for the more than 30 airports that ABA support across the U.S. John Payne is a seasoned business leader with over 20 years of experience in technology and information management. He is currently the CEO and principal consultant for Pueblo Technology Group, Inc., a management consulting firm that provides services to technology providers and the public sector transportation industry, airports, aviations, and smart cities. Pueblo has overseen, helped, procured, and program managed over $1 billion in projects in the last 10 years. In addition to his business role, John is also airport commissioner for Palm Springs International Airport. Now I'm going to turn over the audience to our presenters. Jeff, the audience is all yours.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Good day, everyone. We appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. Kenny, if you can go to the next slide. Our goal today is to give you an example of a unique RFP that was put out by LAWA, Los Angeles World Airports. And we thought it was unique enough that we wanted to give the audience today an opportunity to see how John, who was a principal in writing that RFP, how John approached creating this unique RFP and the challenges that it faced for us to actually respond to it. So we'll go through, John will give you all of his information from the preparation side, and then I'll cover how some of those points affected us when we proposed and created the proposal, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end of it. So John, please.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Kenny, if we could go to the next slide. I'll go through the history, what we were trying to achieve, and I think we were able to achieve it from an RFP standpoint. I've done a number of RFPs across multiple industries, and I think this is probably one of the best that I've been associated with. And I'll jump in right away. Welcome questions at the end of the session. First thing you want to do is talk about what your business problem is in business language. Most people talk about spreadsheets, and you've all seen them, multiple tabs. They have points. You have it now as a product feature. You don't have it. We didn't want to do any of that. We basically sat down and talked about what our business problem was. And it became very clear what we did when we talked about our business problems. We came out with, okay, what is the outcome that you'd like? So we looked at what the business problems were in non-technical business language that senior management could understand. And then we looked at, okay, what is the desired outcome that you'd like to have? In addition, all of these were multiple meetings across the stakeholders. We also looked at, well, how do we measure that success? So if we know what our problem is, and we get aligned on that, then we get aligned on what the outcome is. Now let's align on what the KPIs are to measure success to achieve that outcome. But also, I would strongly recommend you also come up with KPIs to measure progress toward that success. So nobody succeeds on day one. It's usually a journey, and you are a journey over multiple years when it comes to parking because of the complexity and the construction civil aspects of it. So measure your progress toward the success. Benchmark, and then measure that progress, and then measure that you're maintaining that progress. These are all simple to say, but extremely hard to do for those that have tried this. You've got to get everybody in the room. You have to do individual interviews. Often you will not get alignment, or you will get surface alignment. And when you dig down and ask 3 whys, you'll realize that you don't really have alignment on the problem. You have competing agency interests and competing, I'll call it departmental interests within the same agency. So this is something that you need to spend time on. And my advice is to, like with most good projects, spend, measure, you want to measure twice and cut once. You want to spend a lot of time capturing the problem, the outcome, and how you're going to measure success. Your senior management chain will probably get impatient. Your probably immediate managers will get impatient. Say this up front. You understand, but you're going to take an extra week or 2 or a month to be able to collect this information. It is so important in the overall success of the project. Kenny. So you dig in with your stakeholders. You have the usual suspects. I'm assuming everybody on the call knows who those folks are. But there are unusual suspects that you also want to include in your RFP preparation. PD is one. So police and traffic enforcement folks, they need to be involved into the conversation. In airport speak, concessionaires. So for those folks that are not airport folks, concessionaires are people that generate, that's food and beverage retailers at an airport. But there are similar people when we come to your particular city parking issue, and you can fill in the blank there. There are other agencies. Again, in airports, we talk about TSA, the folks that do security. We talk about airport planning folks, and then transit regional employers. Many airports have massive amounts of FedEx personnel. So all of these folks are using parking or have an interest in parking or deal with congestion on the roadway. These are all people that you want to bring into your stakeholder group. EVs and environmental agencies and sustainability folks are very integral to what you're doing when it comes to an RFP. More than likely, you're trying to reduce greenhouse gases. Do you have a current benchmark, and do you know where you want to go over the planning period, let's say 5 years, from X to Y? How do you want to deal with alternative fuels and EV charging stations? Huge emphasis on EV charging at airports and other city agencies across the country. A lot of funding is now available to us through the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act that was passed and now is being funded. Don't forget about hydrogen as an alternative fuel. And of course, TNCs are key stakeholders when it comes to congestion and where their drivers are going to pick up and drop off people. And then finally, back to that outcome on the first slide, what is truly the customer experience that you want your citizens, passengers, travelers, retail shoppers, what do you want that experience to be consistently? What high level of customer experience, how do you want to define it? How do you want to measure it? How do you want to measure progress toward that goal? These are all things that, again, you want to spend significant time on and then put down in writing for alignment for your team. Kenny? So I always want no protests, and that's some of the desired outcomes. So when you write your RFP, you want to ensure that you have the appropriate industry input to avoid any protests. So what that means is transparency. Transparency in what you're trying to achieve. You may want to, and I strongly suggest, if you're concerned about this, you have some industry outreach. So prior to any RFP hitting the street, you post, not necessarily an RFI, although you could do that. You post, I'll call it listening sessions using the facility like Zoom or Teams, and you schedule a broad-based one where multiple people can ask about where you're going and why you're going there. You can ask in individual sessions, letters to industry, and in Zoom sessions, what am I trying to achieve, and what would be your input on the most effective way to have you respond to a competitive solicitation. In your RFP, you absolutely want transparency in costs, and you want transparency in revenues with trends. So how can you achieve that? Ask the industry, how do they want to bid and show those transparencies? Realize that suppliers are like everybody else. We all have to pay the rent. They have to have a fair return on their investment. So often your parking RFP will either have CapEx funds associated with through bonds, or will have a CapEx aspect to it to increase your lanes, to do painting, to fix up a facility that has been in disrepair. There are a number of reasons for a CapEx component to it. And how you deal with that CapEx, whether it's going to be a P3 funded by the winning supplier, a joint venture, et cetera, these are all things that you need to think about with your finance folks on the project. These projects are not cheap. Usually there are 7 figures to 8 figures when it comes to the investment. There are also multiple years. And I think what you need to do is ensure that you give a fair return to the suppliers. And I think that's a great question. I think in a session with suppliers on an outreach, or you're on a Zoom call, ask them, well, what's a fair return? And how do we show that fair return from a transparency standpoint back to the asset owner, the city, the airport, the school, the university, whoever is doing this? I also think that there should be a strong emphasis in your procurement on automation and self-service. Smart cars, TNCs, smartphones, all of this technology that you folks use every day is allowing for more and more self-service. And automation is coming down the road when it comes to smart cars and reduction in labor costs. So when you look at an overall parking budget and what your margin is on a particular space, most of the margin and the costs that eat away at the margin are in labor costs. So I think you hit the nail on the head up front. You talk about automation. You ask in your business outcomes, how can I reduce? What are my costs? Proposer, how are you going to reduce those costs? And measure that reduction year over year. So you want to identify it, and every year you want to see certain costs go down. And show me how you're going to do that. I would also, since many of you are probably in unionized environments, which I mostly only work in unionized environments, you have a heart-to-heart with your local Teamsters and or SEIU or whatever union is representing your parking employees, and say, this is where the world is going, and for us to be viable as an overall entity and increase our revenue, we've got to tackle our existing costs. So you talk about folks maybe retiring out or being upskilled, and then transferring for a new role within the parking operation. Maybe they're working with robots. Maybe they're working on some other aspect. You talk to vendors and suppliers in a proposal and ask them, how would you address automating, reducing costs, and then maintaining whatever ordinances or philosophies your city, county, region, organization has when it comes to what I call making people whole, ensuring that nobody gets treated with disrespect. They're given an opportunity for a new opportunity and hopefully growth within your organization. And then the ability to walk and chew gum. So by that, I mean, parking operation in and of itself is pretty much a known quantity. That is kind of table stakes. So I expect from any supplier in a competitive procurement that you know exactly what you're doing when it comes to the operation of the garage. I'm not going to have people backing up. You've got your fault tolerant and you're redundant when it comes to a problem dropping network links to the credit card processor. The gate guard does not come down and keep there for 15 or 20 minutes, causing havoc, et cetera, et cetera. We lose power. How do you address that? So day-to-day operation, I expect you to be excellent. So that gets a 10 out of 10 or 5 stars. Then we start talking about other things that are important to us. So you've got to walk and chew gum in multiple opportunities. Kenny. Risk mitigation. So where is the risk? Is it on the supplier side? Is it on the owner side? So I address this a couple of different ways. Recommend trying to incent people to do good. Don't penalize them if they do something bad. I've always felt that the suppliers and vendors that you really want in your shop for years, because this is going to be a marriage of years, are people that not necessarily never fail. We all fail. But when they do fail, they step up, say, we made a mistake. Here's the status. Here's what we're doing to fix it. And we will ensure that it doesn't happen again. So it's how does that supplier own up to their problems and put in place people, technology, processes, metrics, measurements to ensure the same thing doesn't happen over and over. And if it does, now we start talking about penalties. But find out what would incent your community of proposers to do good. What kind of incentives? Usually they're financial, but they don't always have to be. They could be just recognition of the employees. As many of you know, if you're recognized in the workplace for doing a good job or an outstanding job, that means that's huge for certain employees, and I would say most employees. So what are the incentives that you could put in place in your procurement, or that your supplier community in your outreach says, this really means something to my people. This means something if we could do this or that the entity might be able to make happen. So baseline then, everything up front, if you can baseline prior to the RFP, fantastic. The more information to the supplier community, the better. Transactions, tickets, where you want to go. There's so many pieces of data that the suppliers want. Again, do an outreach prior to the RFP and get that list of top 3 things or top 10 things and provide that so you get a much more accurate bid. So if you can, baseline up front across the board. If you can't, then part of your RFP to the winning suppliers is something where they do the baseline up front. And this allows you to focus on the incremental gains that cannot be disputed. So what you don't want is supplier wins, you start off, and supplier says, I'm ready for my incentive, end of first year, I'm ready. And you say, what are you talking about? And they say, well, we grew revenue from X to Y. And you say, well, that was just because of the peak season. This is holiday traffic. What are you talking about? Nobody wants those kind of arguments, right? So baseline up front, put it in the RFP if you can. If not, phase 1 of your successful supplier is the baseline that they have to provide you and you all agree on. And then reference check. This is huge. Almost nobody does this. It always amazes me. And nobody takes it seriously. So when you do a reference check, ensure that you spend half hour to an hour on that reference check, digging into that supplier that you think might be the winner for you, and talk to a senior person. A hands-on manager or first level line person is great, but then go up the chain to validate what is being said by somebody who has real skin in the game. A VP, a senior director, whatever that management's organization is, the CEO, the executive director, ensure that the reference check and that particular person does believe that that supplier is really good at what they do. And what you want to hear is well, you know what? Started out a little rocky. They made some assumptions that wasn't right. I had to talk to them, but they cleaned up their act. They got it together, and we are now very happy with them. It tells you what you're going to need to do in your contract negotiations with the winning supplier. So don't short shrift reference checking. Take the time to do it right. Put a good person on the reference check. Document the reference check. It's not just, yeah, I talked to him. It's really, I really did talk to him, and here's what I found out, and here's what we need to watch out for, or here's how we can leverage what this other person's experience are. Kenny. So you want to mix responsibilities on that selection process team where you have to actually pick them up. You want people that have line responsibility, financial responsibility, revenue responsibility, operation, and then senior management responsibility. You want to be able to have a cross-section of people that will look at the vendor and the suppliers and the short list from a variety of different lenses. I would also, if you're in a what we'll call a protest happy kind of place, then I think you want 1 or 2 external non-agency reps. So depending on the size of the procurement, I always want some external people that are within the region that will sit on the selection team and provide their perspective. You know, a peer agency from a sister city or a sister airport, someone that kind of has gone through this before in the perfect world or is going through it now. We want to watch out for conflicts of interest, but the perfect person is somebody who just completed a similar procurement of a similar scope and size, probably within 2 years of what you're doing. So huge win there, 1 or 2 to provide their input. And with all of us doing remote work and work from home and Zoom and Teams, these people, you're really not dealing with a lot of effort here. There's really no travel. So I would take advantage of that. And you want people on the team, the selection team, that are both tactical and strategic. So you look at that from the standpoint of, look, this person only cares about the day-to-day. That's actually really good. But also you want people that care about the strategic. Here's where we're going with mobility as a service. Here's where we're going with EV. Here's where we're going with sustainability and greenhouse gases. Here's where we're going with ESG-like activities in regards to social responsibility and equity, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. Again, business and technical. Technical IT people should be on it because there's going to be a lot of technology in your procurement. However, they should be, I believe, subordinate to and deferring to the business leadership. So absolutely, technology people have to participate. But as an old techie person and a CIO for a government agency, I think the place for us is in support and service to the business leadership. So you don't always win. You want the voices heard. But again, we're trying to solve a business problem and achieve business outcomes. And then I would argue that you want to increase your margins. You want to reduce your costs. You want to be in compliance, improve that customer experience. And you have to manage all of these at once. So in your selection process, these are the major categories I would use to rate your suppliers and proposers in, and realize that no one thing will win. It'll be, what do you think is the best way to balance all of these together and score accordingly? I think I'm on my last slide, Kenny. Yeah. So what do you know? Trust, nothing beats it. I have been in procurements where we were right down to the wire. We were about to make the selection, or we made a selection that was the initial draft selection. And somebody said, on the selection panel, I just don't trust these guys. Oops. Okay, thanks for telling us. And then we have a long conversation around trust. You should not, you're getting into a marriage, you've heard the platitude, it's a relationship, it'll be 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years, and you got to work with somebody you trust. So the supplier relationship has to be built on trust, because there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be people that leave, there'll be misunderstandings, honest misunderstandings, etc. So you got to have trust. So that could be maybe an unwritten criteria, because it is so subjective. Admittedly, it's very subjective, but you've got to be able to trust. Your selection panel has to be able to trust your vendors that you select. Big one here, really consider using an external attorney on the contract negotiation. Many city attorneys do a parking contract and then do somebody else's contract or another agency's contract. As you folks know, it's not one size fits all, and it's not the same thing. It's a very, very particular skill set and set of issues that you've got to address when it comes to parking, congestion, policy. It's very complex. So as you begin this journey, maybe the first step you make is you talk to legal counsel that's in your agency, and you find out who did the last parking agreement. Oh, they're no longer here. Okay. Can we consider talking to an external attorney for the contract negotiation part, or getting advice? Almost all city attorneys have external counsel for litigation. They usually have special counsel for contract negotiation as well. So that would be the first step I would take is, can I get external counsel? Project will pay for it. It will save you millions of dollars potentially. And then finally, you've heard it before, but I'll hit it again. External powers that be, ensure they're all on board and aligned from the very beginning. It saves so much heartache and time. Your management chains, your peer management chains, et cetera, whatever oversight organization you've got, you have a board, you've got a commission, because we're dealing with a lot of money here and a long-term contract and commitment. make certain that they're all involved, however they get represented. And then finally, think about the citizens, back to customer experience. They're going to use this and generate the revenue and be critical of the costs, make certain that they're represented in some way, shape, or form. I welcome questions at the end of the session. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it. As John was going through that, I realized that maybe we should put a little bit of context in what we're talking about in this particular process, this RFP being unique. The reason I say that is because John defined a lot of steps in there that take additional time. They incur additional expenses, and you don't know if you're putting an RFP out for a small airport or a small stadium or a small university for your parking operations, and you're not going to, in all honesty, you're not going to spend more on your budget to create the RFP than you would on the revenue for the first year. So let's give it a little bit of scope. The LAWA put out this RFP. Their RFP was to collect the existing and projected $100 million a year in parking revenue. At the end of the process, the contract was for 7 years with 2 one-year extensions. The contract for the 7 years was a total value of $303 million, and that included $42 million that ABM would front as part of the CapEx, capital investment, in which LAWA chose how fast they wanted to pay that off. So that's a little bit of context. 6 million transactions a year, 10 garages, some of them as far as 30 miles away. So as we go through this process, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context. This was a really unique contract in that, again, as John said, he took it from the outcomes process. He didn't say, we want a revenue control system that does A, B, C, D, and E. They don't want a parking guidance system that has to have this level of accuracy. They didn't want a network that could do this or could not do that. What they said is, we want the best network that provides the most functionality, but also the greatest compliance and security. They want a park system that will support the largest number of parking products, that provides the most stability, is the most common or the newest technology, and then also has the ability to add that technology in the future. So this was a unique opportunity for all of the proposers, but we had to take a step back and decide, are we even going to be involved in this process? Because it was completely unique and it represented a lot of risk to both the proposer, just as it did with the airport. So some of the things that we used to decide on if we wanted to provide this service or submit a proposal. One is we knew that we were going, as this contract called for the operator to act as a general contractor. So that meant, as John lovingly referred to it during our contract negotiations, one throat to choke. So the airport decided we're not going to negotiate with a parks vendor, a parking guidance system, a valet parking system, an EV provider. You guys are responsible for that. You guys said you could meet these certain outcomes, and it's your responsibility to herd all of those cats. When it doesn't work, we're going to come to you and tell you it's not working, and it's your responsibility to fix it. So we had to make sure that we felt comfortable in going into this process, that we had the right subcontractors with us. And that we spent most of our preparation time on the contract negotiations with our subcontractors. We also were concerned, because this was such a general approach, we were concerned about, are we going to be able to provide accurate costing information? If we say that we need $42 million to do infrastructure and equipment investment, is that 42 enough? Have we been able to see it? We were really concerned about that aspect of it. Again, not too many operators have ever gone into this environment and acted like a general contractor for infrastructure to come in. So when we say infrastructure, we actually mean tearing up lanes and rebuilding the lanes. And then finally, can we commit to developing an entirely new product? What LAWA wanted, their RFP said, we don't want what you guys did last year. We don't want what New York is doing right now or Atlanta is doing right now. We expect this to meet these outcomes, be future-proofed, increase that net revenue, reduce the operating expenses, and to improve the guest experience. And we don't want something that was rehashed from 3 years ago. We recognized that we had to come up with an entirely new product. That took time to get all of our leadership on board with the fact that this was just not business as usual. Kenny? So how did we prepare for this? I'm explaining this to you all because you guys all know the RFP process on your side, creating the RFP process. My goal on this one right here was to show what happened on the operators or the proposers side, so that when you look at an RFP like this, how much can you get from them? And what are their risks? Because if you write, I don't think the first one we got too many responses to it, except that we got about 300 questions when we had the first release. And that identified a gap between what the airport wanted and what the proposers felt like they were comfortable proposing. If you get 300 questions on there, everybody has questions on that. The airport took that information, took back the original proposal or RFP, and then went out and rewrote it and felt like it was a much more comprehensive package. So what did we invest? What did the operator invest to create this? 2 director level positions for 6 months. That's all we did, myself and one other director, for 6 months, is negotiate subcontracts, design the system, go to each one of those subcontractors and say, can you provide this? What's the best you can provide? That sounds good, but every single one of those subcontractors, we rejected their initial concept and said, no, it's got to be better. So it's 6 months in the development of the proposal. Also, it was a new approach. When we designed the system and we proposed it, we didn't know if the airport was going to look at it and say, that's not even close to what we want. So we really had to step back and build that confidence in what we were proposing. And is this meeting their goals as we understand their goals? We really had to look at the whole picture of what LAWA wanted to do. Next slide. Desired outcomes. Just like the airport having a desired outcome, we wanted a desired outcome as well. One of it, we wanted to win the contract. And winning the contract that we proposed, had favorable financial terms to us. Just as John said, everybody is in this for a benefit. Nobody takes on these types of large projects as a charity process. And for the people who put out proposals there's going to be money made. The more that money is put on top of the table, is clearly identified, and everybody agrees that that's a good price, the more chances that that's what the money is going to be made. The more people try to whittle that down or don't recognize the challenges of each side, both the airport and the proposer, the more that money being made moves below the table. So one is we wanted to win the contract, but we recognized early in this process that working with this client for the next 7 years on this project was going to be an opportunity that we used to pivot the entire approach of ABM to parking operations, whether that was commercial, universities, stadiums, or airports. So we had an invested interest in making this work because it wasn't just for LAWA. We were using this, all of the research we did on this project, we used this to identify that there is a better way to do what we were doing. And so we had an invested interest past just this contract. Next slide. Just like LAWA had a risk there, they're choosing us to manage this. If we don't develop what we do, first of all, part of the responsibilities for what we submitted was we had to forecast the revenue that we expected that would be increased over organic. Organic, we all know that there's, we use a percentage based on how many flyers are increasing, maybe some basic rate increases. But you say, as an example, hey, we expect 3% organic growth over every year over the course of the contract. That's if we didn't touch anything, we stayed exactly the way we were, we would expect 3%. We had to go in there and propose what SmartParking was going to do to drive that revenue past that 3% organic. We don't get credit for the number of flyers increasing. We get credit on if the flyers, if the number of parkers as a ratio to the passengers increased. Did we attract more parkers? How much was each parker spending? Those were the KPIs that we had to commit. So we had to be comfortable that and they forced us in this case, we had to project what the revenue was going to be. So we had to be comfortable that we could risk that commitment because we were going to be held accountable. We had to reduce our risk. Our risk was we were, again, the general contractor. We were the one providing that one throat. We had to have confidence in our subcontractors. And we spent a lot of time with subcontractors, some of which we chose, some of which we didn't choose in the end. We had a lot of confidence that they were looking at this opportunity the same way we were. They were looking at this as an opportunity to introduce a bunch of new functionality that they would turn around and benefit from just as much as LAWA did. There was another risk was an emphasis on the assumptions and the system's functionality. So we had to recognize that no matter how much we spoke, we were proposing new things. We were proposing integrations between parks and parking guidance and reservation systems that didn't exist. We were proposing taking data and transforming that data to meet the airport's needs in ways that data had never been transformed before. So one of the risks that we had to sit down and come comfortable with is, are we going to be able to count on ourselves and on our subcontractors to deliver on these commitments as well as within the budget? So those are the risks that we measured ourselves. Every operator out there knows if they make a commitment, they're going to have to meet the commitment. It doesn't take long for that information to get out that, we heard a lot of promises in the beginning, but we didn't see any of them happen, or we saw 30%. Next slide. So some of the key things that really contributed to the final product that we have is that the contract negotiations themselves, 3 months of contract negotiations. John and I spoke together more than most people are comfortable speaking together outside of their families. And that was because we went through every single line of our proposal, and we said, John said, this is the way we interpret it towards our outcomes. And we said, that's exactly the way. Or no, we said this, or this is what we meant. And there's no language, nobody is ever going to write a contract that doesn't have an opportunity for interpretation. You can't even try to use numbers to get rid of that interpretation. What John and LAWA did is make sure that they went through line by line with us and said, what do you mean here? We like this, or you have to tweak this. This is not what we wanted. So 3 months for contract negotiations. The contract negotiations were the most interesting that I've ever done, because for those 3 months, 2 months and 29 days pretty much was spent with the doers. Myself and one other person on ABM were the ones that wrote the proposals, negotiated with the subcontractors. John was instrumental, and so was their parking, their primary parking contract administrator. We are the ones that sat down and negotiated with that. And every time we would finish a session, we would highlight the things that we thought that our bosses would need, and we'd go take them back to our bosses and say, this is the direction we're moving. But I don't know, I'm sure that it's the same with John, but by doing that on a level like that, by having the people who are involved in not only executing it, Brett was the one that was going to execute the contract, and myself is the one that wrote the proposal and the concept behind it. By doing it this way, we were able to ensure that our bosses said, hey, you know what, that's great. You guys are the ones that have to execute it. You've identified the risk for us. We've accepted the risk. And then that final conversations between the dads at the end for the signatures was much smoother. And then we talked a little bit about going through each line. That also addressed detailed conversations on functionality and KPI. So next slide. So what was the final product? I would say, and I hope that John would agree with me, I would say that the product we have at month 18, and it's still not, the installation is still not complete. The product we have at the 18th month is even more different, is even a better product than we proposed. And it's a better product that we had at month 9 because of the way the contract was written, the way that the subcontracts were negotiated, the way that the airport was willing to sit down with us and say, hey, we just came up with this idea. We want to try this integration. We want to integrate the online booking system, the PGS and the parks in order to get this kind of functionality, but this is what we have to do it. They were willing to sit down and say, okay, sometimes it was, yeah, hey, that's a good idea. Maybe there was no change. Maybe it was a tweak and moving stuff from one bucket to another. Other times they said, no, really don't spend any effort on that. We don't have any interest on that. And then what ABM did is we sat down with our contractors and said, okay, we can't spend time on it, but do we still want to do it for our own benefit? And we kept doing that constantly throughout the process with LAWA. So it was a true collaboration. John spoke about the trust. When it's a $303 million, yes, they absolutely had trust when we sat down. But that doesn't mean that they just gave us a checkbook and said, hey, let us know how it turns out. They set up mechanisms so that as we built this, we went through their IT department, their finance department, their executive team and said, this is where we're at on it. And this is why we're doing this, what we're doing. And do you agree with our approach? And any time that they didn't agree, they said, okay, we don't agree, but how does this impact your proposed revenue over the course of the contract? And so we'd say, well, if we don't do this, this is what happens to the revenue. Maybe it's no change, but maybe in some cases it's a change. And then they decided if they wanted to make us change, or if they wanted to hold us more accountable to that revenue projection. And I don't think at any time did they ever choose their concept over our revenue projections. They always wanted to hold us to our revenue projections. It was I think everybody agreed today that it's a living project. For every time that we finish and hit a benchmark, we create probably 3 other benchmarks. Maybe one of those benchmarks we knew was going to follow, and 2 of them are going to be something completely different. But that's the concept. The airport was very specific, and when they said, we want you to demonstrate and commit continuous improvement. It has to be continuous improvement. We don't want to spend $42 million up front in the course of a year, and then you guys just sit back for the next 6 years. It has to be continuous improvement. And then finally, the product today has driven how we propose new contracts and what our operating model is going to be for all of our parking operations. So when we look at this project and we go to ABM's executive teams and say we want to do this or we want to do that, what we make sure that they understand is this is going to benefit LAWA and our client. It is also going to benefit ABM. There's a clear benefit on both parties going forward on the path that we're doing. Next slide. I think that was the final one. So with that, there's some information probably too detailed, some information probably a little bit too high, but we would like to open it up for questions. I think, Kenny, you'll screen the questions for us.
Yeah, right now, if anybody has any questions on the presentation, please drop them into the chat for our presenters. I'll give you guys a few seconds to drop some questions in the chat based on what you've just heard.
And just if you don't have any questions right now, or you think about it, this is a lot of information, then please don't hesitate. Kenny will give everybody access to us. We would love to follow up with people. We're also going to be at the IPMI conference. If you want to ask questions there, by all means, they don't have to be structured.
Yes, thank you. Any questions from our participants? Give you guys a couple more seconds.
Well, either Kenny, we did really well, or we were just horrid. I have no idea.
Well, so Mr. SM Soto or Mrs. Not sure. It says just great information. Thank you. So yeah, very good information given out. Any questions?
Hey, Kenny, I was going to pop in with a question if that's okay.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Easier than typing. So this is terrific, and I actually have a background. I started as a marketing coordinator, working with wonderful and talented technical people on all of those things and big proposals, right? And I know we have some of our AEC firms on here and other places. Do you have ideas or recommendations on connecting the worlds, say, of the marketing professional, the communications professional, and the technical side, right? Because it's often that there's a breakdown sometimes, right? In how that goes. So just I see it from the marketing side. Would love your perspective on how that works best.
John, do you want to give that a shot?
John, you're on mute.
Oh, $5 in the pot.
Yeah, $5. Rachel, could you rephrase a little bit? I was trying to follow. I think I missed it.
No worries. So there are for the folks who not everyone works on RFPs, right?
Yeah.
From the respondent side, right? Supplier vendor side. And I came up in marketing. And one of the things is that there's sometimes a disconnect between your marketing teams and your technical professionals. And especially on really, really big proposals, how can that be worked around, for the folks who are preparing the RFP, the response, all those kinds of good things. Because I know that it can be a difficult challenge.
Yeah, I think what often happens, I've observed on the supplier side is everybody has a lot of work to do and people save it to the very end. Mm-hmm. Do not do that. So from a supplier side, when you finally decide to go after this, then get your team set up and be able to ask questions, right? What happens is it's due in 2 weeks, it's been out for 3 months, and all of a sudden it's a fire drill. Everybody's running around. Mm-hmm. So it's really difficult, and this is what I really don't like about the RFP process, but from a public sector owner perspective, you have to have this extremely formal exchange of information. And it's very limited. You cannot have a simple conversation. I can't take a phone. I'm in the middle of one now. I can't take a phone call and just say, and talk to a supplier and say, okay, this is what we're doing, right? It leads to a protest, right? Sure. So get involved up front if you own it from a supplier standpoint and you have a particular thing, and find out, how do I talk to the RFP process, right? Mm-hmm. There's always a deadline for questions. Make certain you haven't lost that. Ask for an extension. So get involved up front, ask questions. If it's passed, then ask for an extension, because everybody is in the same boat and they're all waiting for someone to be brave enough to ask for an extension, right?
Absolutely.
But we get it all the time.
Awesome. Well, I'll pop off. You have some technical questions to answer here in the chat, so I'll let Kenny handle those.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, guys. Danielle Clark asked, what do you think was the greatest challenge that you faced in this process?
From the writer or from the responder?
Probably both.
Okay. Writer, what was your greatest challenge?
Two. I would say the greatest challenge is the senior leader in the organization had a vision, and it was fantastic. Everyone below that had no clue. So what? Why would we do that? We've never done that before. So we were probably on the client side, owner side, we were 20 years behind the times, literally. And we needed to first articulate the vision in business language to line staff and above, get everybody on the same page. CFO said, why would we want to spend all this money on tech? I mean, what is a parking guidance system? Why do I care? Who would make a reservation? Nobody's ever made a reservation for parking before. Everybody knows you drive in, get stuck in gridlock, and maybe you don't get to park. What's the problem? We're making all this money anyway, right? So there was a whole set of people that need to get on board, aligned on a single vision, which took a lot of effort. That was probably the biggest challenge. And then the second biggest challenge is going through all of the internal process because of the size of the contract. Legal was extremely difficult because, again, it was new and a new approach. And, we don't have it. Everybody wants the spreadsheet that when you hit auto sum, pops out with vendor A at 20 points, vendor B at 80 points, and vendor C at 5 points. They want one winner, clear, points, boom, done. It just, life isn't that way, right? Life is not that way. This wasn't that way. And this was something that took a long time to explain, but I think the benefit is now proven. So that was the two biggest ones.
And then on the proposer side, I think where John, his organization, it was the top person that had the vision, and they had to spend a bunch of time convincing the people below it. On our side, and this is just unique to this contract, but we recognize the value of this, the long-term value, and we had to sell that up. So that was one challenge. The other challenge was, because of the size of the contract, because of the size of the capital investment on our side, we really spent a lot of time on risk mitigation internally. That was one of the biggest challenges.
Thank you, guys. Chris Clark asked, how did you handle inflation in the fixed price?
So on our side, well, I guess you would say is because we just hope it didn't happen, because when we did this contract, it was 2019 when we started the pricing process. And I don't think anybody pictured, the inflation that we have today. So
and pre-COVID.
Yeah. So on our side right there, what we do is in our contracts is we say, with transparency, this is the rate that we're increasing the expenses by line item. And we make sure that the airport or the client, whether it's a stadium too, we make sure that they understand that's the percentage we do it. And then we say what those assumptions are based on. A perfect example in LA is part of our contract negotiations was to make sure that we took into account that Los Angeles is very quick to make changes to their living wage ordinance, right? And so, of course, they want a document that identifies their expenses as far as out as they possibly can. But at the same time, we made sure in the contract that we weren't the only ones bearing the liability should the city of Los Angeles or the county of Los Angeles decide to increase their living wage ordinance by $5 an hour.
Thank you. Raymond Humbert asks, Jeff, how often did you sit down with the airport to review the numbers where you could adjust your projections?
We do that a lot, actually, because especially since COVID, when people started to come back, we found out two things. One is the market segmentation was completely different. So as people came back, you couldn't assume it was that 30% leisure and 70% business the way it was pre-COVID. It was actually flipped. And those leisure has different needs, different expectations, perceptions than the business does. So we constantly had to work with the airport to recognize that. And then the other thing is we did this, we're implementing SmartParking in the process of $8 billion, John, in landside renovations. So there's constant changes going on. Your revenue projections are based on how many spaces do you have at what rate, and that's what your revenue projections are. Well, we lost 1,000 spaces out of 15,000 that we thought we were going to have. That's a pretty big chunk of number of spaces to lose. Some of those spaces had greater value than others. If we lost a space that was in the back of the garage in a dark corner, that value wasn't as high as if we lost it right next to the crosswalk going over to the airport. So we've probably done 3 or 4 reforecast. Sometimes we're only reforecasting specific products. Other times, like I think we're wrapping up right now, our second complete reforecast of all revenue streams.
I would also add in your competitive solicitation, throw in some sections on how rates are set. So every jurisdiction has different approaches to setting rates, and oversight commissions and the citizens have a big interest in what the rates are and why they are the way they are. So often proposers don't really think about, well, the rate's not going to get popped. It's going to have to go through a process. How long is it and how does it work? So I would always include that in any solicitation.
And what ALAWA did was totally unique. They convinced the board to trust the airport, and the airport gave them a range of rates. And that is hugely important when it comes to commercial management. So that ability to move those rates around, usually it's in the form of a discount, but sometimes it's in the form of increasing the rates, but to have that flexibility. Revenue is generated by taking advantage of the environment as it is at that moment. And if you have a long, painful process that requires you to go through 3 months process to make a change to a rate, you're losing flexibility. So I thought that was very good with LAWA, that they went through and approved a range of rates.
Great, thank you. And one last question here. Timothy McGuire asks, how did you incorporate EV charging into your overall strategy? If so, how did you identify how many stations would be needed? How did you build a pricing strategy for those chargers? And finally, how did you identify potential supplier partners to deliver on the program?
Could I take the first part, Jeff, and you can take the second? So we're in California, and strong interest in EVs, EV charging networks, the creation of EV cars, smart cars, the whole bit. And so very strong desire to be one of the leaders when it comes to EV. So it's a large percentage of available parking spaces were desired to be EV. And back to talking to all the stakeholders, we found out after a significant period of time that a sister organization was about to let an RFP for charging for the actual consumption of electricity. So instead of it being free, you would have to charge and you'd pay for it, just like a parking meter, like Approach. And so I went and sat down with the CEO and just said, hey, why are we doing a separate RFP? We can incorporate this into our competitive solicitation because it falls within the larger view of parking. And the owner of that RFP said, that'd be fantastic. You've saved me 18 to 24 months just to get to a vendor, let alone actual implementation. So in your competitive solicitation process, ensure that you give yourself some wiggle room. And I'll a bit tongue in cheek, other tasks as desired, but there's language that you can put that allows you to expand your solicitation and add something like EV, which is how we got it into the solicitation and contract at the last moment, which allowed us to move so much faster than we otherwise would. So driven by state, governor, city, airport, green sustainability initiatives to get to EV, and we had a mechanism to do that. And I'll let Jeff close up.
So the biggest part of that question I think that you asked is most interesting to the biggest group of people is, how did we price it? And so first of all, every single EV station we have is monetized. How we monetize it is different. The EV services that we provide inside Ballet is just an amendment, is a amenity. You in some places you pay extra for a car wash. In that you pay extra for a charge for your EV. In other places, most other places, it is a flat fee to connect, and then it's a price per kilowatt hour after that. We've not got any pushback specifically for how much we're charging either one of those. And in all honesty, I think John would agree with us too. We haven't got as much pushback as people were feared because we added the cost to it. At the end of the day, everybody knows that they're going to have to do it. And so many people are buying EVs for the first time. They don't even know what they're paying at home for the charges. So that's how we priced it. The flexibility in the rates that they got from the board allows us to make sure that we really got the best price and to change it if we can't.
And one thing I'd add is when you do your design and implementation, again, one of the key things from an outcome perspective we wanted is a single bill. So if you bought valet reserve space with EV charging class 1, that's all added into the charge, and it's a single charge. It's not like when you go to the doctor and you get basically a bill from the doctor, a bill for the facility, and a bill from a lab. 3 bills, separate times, right? It's single bill, etc. So you want to design to that goal.
Good. Thank you so much, guys. Great questions. Any final thoughts from you guys before we close out today?
Spend the time up front. Really think about the RFP and think about what you really want over the term of the contract and spend time writing it down.
Don't take the burden of coming up with the best system yourself. Don't let procurement come up with it, or IT by themselves come up with it, or operations. Make the people who are going to operate and things like that, make them identify the best system for you. That's what they do.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. Again, I want to thank our presenters today, Jeff and John, for hosting today's Learning Lab. We thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Everybody, have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you.